Well, Matthew only tells us some. So there's still plenty there to wonder about. And as we go through them, we'll find out that even what he tells us, so for instance, with the interpretation of the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds, he still doesn't tell us really what it means completely or what it means for us to live. He just interprets symbols in it. So there's still a lot yet to be open-ended. But you're right, he wants to go farther than Mark for sure. The question is this related to Gnosticism of the period? And the Gnostics, if you don't know about the Gnostics, for instance, like Nag Hammadi and these others, argued to have secret knowledge that was behind these texts and all. So for instance, there was Jesus and the Christ were not the same. The Christ came into the Jesus, and so it's all this esoteric stuff. And here there is language of mystery and secrets. And is that the same thing? And the answer is no. This is not that same kind of stuff. But there are some linguistic parallels, so you're right to recognize that. But there were Jewish Gnostics before Christianity was even around. And then there was the whole Christian form of Gnosticism. But it's really a completely different thing. There are elements of John, the Gospel of John, that are more Gnostic. But a lot of people read those as really being anti-Gnostic. So you're using Gnostic language to fight against them, things like that. I am not an expert on Gnosticism. I'm fascinated with it, but I am in no ways an expert. Except I can confidently say that's not what this is. So this is assuming God as transcendent, assuming the reign of God as not yet, means there's plenty of mystery just there, right? But we should acknowledge that one of the biggest, most influential forms of religion in the Roman Empire at this time were the mystery religions. And so they celebrated that there was insider language, and every religion has insider language. You got your secret handshake, your secret rituals, you know, secret ways of referring to this or that. And even if it's not secret, it's just intercultural kinds of things. So Christianity was no different. It certainly claimed that there were some unique things that we hold that the whole world doesn't know. All right, so we want to, let's just start reading through these parables and talk about them in order. These are so common to you. So I don't know how you do it, but I'm going to invite you to try and pretend you've never heard these before. Try and notice things in them that you haven't seen. Back to the use of the term exegesis. I tell my students, if you want to be a good preacher, every time you interpret a text, you should assume your past interpretation of it is wrong. If you start with the idea, and in the end, you might end up confirming exactly what you already think about the text, right? But if you go in with the attitude that whatever I've thought about this is wrong, or at least, you know, has elements that are wrong or something, then you're looking for something new. And you will see things you haven't seen before. As opposed to, if I preach on the prodigal son, because I've preached on it 100 times, I don't need to really go look at it anew, I'm there, I'm good. That doesn't offer me anything new or my congregation. So I'm inviting you to imagine, because I'm probably going to argue you've heard some of these wrong. I mean, just if we go by the pattern of the morning, that seems to be part of my personality, then you might as well start off assuming some of it is wrong, and let's see what we do. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the parable of the sower before we start, in terms of biblical scholarship, I mean. Throughout much of the history of the church, people have read parables as allegories. And by allegories, I mean a symbolic story in which every detail lines up with a symbol. So the seed is a symbol of something, this type of ground is a symbol for something, etc. Some of the parables are clearly allegories. But the problem is we have made almost all of them that way through history. And biblical scholars throughout the 20th century started going, you know, I think that's wrong. In fact, notice that C.H. Dodd's language didn't use language of allegory at all, symbols, etc. Instead, it's the whole of the story that presents it. So, unless Scripture offers an allegorical interpretation like Jesus does of the parable of the sower, you should assume it's not an allegory. Remember, we looked just a little bit ago at the parable of the talents, and I asked, who is the master? And somebody said God or Jesus. I can't remember what it said, which is natural way. But no, because if you look at it, then the master is a terrible symbol for God, because the master reaps where he doesn't sow. We don't want to think of God in those terms. So the symbolism might be a light symbolism with a really small s, in the sense that we get the sense of the dynamics of the relationship, but you don't want to make too much of it. And so a lot of interpretation has done things like say, okay, this group are the Jews, and this group, they're the Christians. And so when you look at it, look how much better the Christians are. It's odd that the church has never said the church is the one that looks bad in the parable. All right? So that's part of the anti-Semitic strain in our history. So even when it's not used that way. So I want you to, this story, this opening story is clearly an allegory, at least as Matthew interprets it. But I don't want you to start just looking in every parable for symbols. Look at the whole when we go. So let me read this first one. That same day, let me start with actually. It starts at the end of verse 3. Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil. And they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. Since they had no root, they were withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Okay, let's think about our definition of parable again first to see it played out. How does it start, the definition? Okay, do we have a narrative? Okay, so we have a plot. We got characters. Okay, what's the next part? Drawn from nature, or is this common? Yeah, people farmed back then, agrarian culture. Okay, what's the next part? What leaves it insufficient now? There's something before that. Vividness or strangeness. Now, when I usually have heard this preached, people trying to explain how everything works and everything. So what's vivid or strange in this parable? How do you know that? How do you know how ancient people did agriculture? They didn't have a plow. Okay, that's not the strange part about this, because we actually know this is the way people did it. In fact, there are some studies that show the way you farmed back then was you actually threw seed out and then you plowed it under the ground, as opposed to plowed the furrows and then did it. So if you throw it out, you can take lots of time and put it around, but that's a real loss of time, right? So when you just think about the economy of your work day, you would throw it around. Now, you didn't throw it loosey-goosey. So one of the things that we often misinterpret about this parable, which led you down this path, which, as I warned you, I was going to tell you were wrong. So, I gave you a warning. But we assume, because there's several forms of what goes bad here. That doesn't mean that's lots of seed lost, right? So you think about a garden area, a field. The good soil is all in the middle, but if you're throwing to get to the corners, some's going around the edge. So we don't have to assume that everything's lost. The other thing we have to remember is this isn't, the most fertile land in the world. So there's going to be things growing up and stuff. Okay, but there's something else that's strange here. It's just we've heard it so many times it doesn't seem strange. So these numbers, we've just heard them so long, we're used to it. But seed fell on good soil, brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. The seed bringing that much, how much can one seed bring up? Right? So this is incredible abundance. Okay? What we have is the beginning of the already not yet laid out. The not yet is an abundance we cannot imagine. So the image of growth and size is a metaphor to help that come apart. So what we have in the already is the reality of sowing seed, where there's good soil and there's bad types of soil, and the seed is spread, and some is, producing and some not. That's just the way it is. But the not yet is when it finally produces as it can in the eschatology, in the eschaton, in God's reign. My gosh, you won't believe how much grain. Right? So the numbers in ancient mind would be huge. Now let's look at the interpretation of it. So the question becomes, what does that mean, right? That's the next part of the definition. So what? What do we do with that? Look at you guys. You're trying to be so literal. It's a parable, right? Part of what's going on here is anybody would go, no, that's not the way this works, right? All right, so I'm going to give you cumulative evidence that this is the way it's unfolding throughout the discourse. So yeah, you can make ways to say, oh, that's not an oddity, right? So the number of tomatoes, the heads of grain on there, wait a minute. And you can argue it, but that's our modernist, historical, scientific approach to trying to explain these things. So I'll give you a good example to apply this to. It's a good analogy. The story of the feeding of the 5,000. There have been sermons after sermons that have turned these into a stewardship thing, because here's what happens. Jesus says, feed them, and the disciples say, we've only got a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread. And so then they say, okay, bring them here. They bless them. They hand them out. They collect 12 baskets of leftovers. And then people like William Barclay and other interpreters say, see, generosity begets generosity. It's not a miracle. It's that when Jesus gave out food, others gave out food and let it go and all this extra. The Bible's written on a need-to-know basis. You don't have to make stuff up. That is not the way the ancient mind worked. The ancient mind said, Jesus fed 5,000 with 2 fish. That's pretty darn cool, right? You don't have to explain it. The parables even less so. Remember, these are fictional stories. You wouldn't try and explain in Goldilocks that bears don't really have beds. Right? So you've got to take it at its face value. Okay. Oh, clearly the vividness, the oddity here is the harvest. Absolutely. That it's an overabundance of produce from... Now, most of the sermons you hear are all about the sowing. And I'll bet you've been asked, what kind of soil are you? You ever heard that? Or you've been asked, where are you throwing your seed? Yeah, that could go a lot of different ways. But that is not what this parable is about. This parable is about the reign of God. It's not about what you're doing. It's naming the dynamics of existence in between the already and not yet. So it's naming the fact that we experience the goodness of God, and yet there is failure and suffering in the world still nevertheless. So look at the interpretation. Verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom of God, so there it is, the kingdom. So again, it's when everyone hears the eschatological word and doesn't understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. Okay, you got to quit thinking about evil one, Satan, in modern imagery of the little pitchfork who comes around and tempts us, or the little devil on this shoulder and the little angel on this one. This is an apocalyptic battle between God and Satan. And so this makes it look like Satan's winning, right, at this point. 20, as for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures for only a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. Do you remember in the eschatological discourse, is persecution the sign of the end of the time? It's just the way of being church. Persecution's part of it, but people fall away. Not everyone remains faithful. It's just the way it is in the already, without the not yet. As for what's sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, another 60, and another 30. This is a description of the life of the church in the already not yet. We measure everything by success. How much money did the stewardship drive get? How many butts are in the pews on Easter Sunday? You know, we are counters in a way. And this would seem to highlight that, except one of the things that's clear is you can't count yet, because the tally isn't ready. In the in-between time, we just got to deal with that tension. And I think part of what's going on here is in this discourse is just trying to get people comfortable with living in the tension of the already not yet. Not becoming apathetic or lackadaisical in it, but recognizing this is simply the way things are. We're going to be this way.